Hey guys, John here with BD Diesel. Today we're working on an 03 Cummins and we're going to install a 5.9 Screamer Turbo upgrade. So let's get started. So the very first step is to disconnect the negative battery terminals before we get going. After that, you want to block and secure the wheels, or in this case, we have access to a hoist, which is going to make our job a little bit easier. And now that the truck's up in the air, we're going to pull the wheel for a little more access and then the inner fender as well. Now that we have better access to the turbocharger, we're going to put a little penetrating fluid on these clamps here, which are on the exhaust casting down to the downpipe, so we can get those removed next. Now that the clamps are loose, we want to get the casting out of the way. To make life a little bit easier, I'm going to lift the truck up and pull the exhaust back with a ratchet strap. Now that the exhaust is pulled back a bit to gain a little more access, I'm going to pull the casting out. The next step is to remove the turbo oil drain bolts. The front one is here, the rear one is behind the tube. Now that the bolts are removed, I just tap the oil drain with a little mallet and a drift to knock the gasket loose. So now it's just floating here. On this particular model, it's a hard drain with a rubber hose section. You can loosen the gear clamps on the hose section to swivel the drain out of the way for a little more room. Now that the oil drain is removed, I've sprayed up the turbo mounting nuts with some penetrating fluid, as well as the oil feed fitting, make it a little easier to crack loose. So the next step is to disconnect the oil feed line to gain better access to the turbo mounting bolts. The next step here is to loosen up the turbo mounting bolts that are accessible from the lower side here. That's these guys right here up on the manifold. Okay, now that we have the turbocharger mounting nuts loosened and then the rear underneath ones removed, we're going to lower the whole truck back down to get access to the top and work our way in from there. All right, now that we got the truck back down, we're going to remove this air intake, including disconnect this baro sensor and get closer access to the turbocharger. Okay, the next step here is to disconnect the intercooler tube, which comes from the compressor of the turbocharger to the intercooler up front. That's this tube right here. And the clamp we want to disconnect is just right here off the compressor cover. And we'll try to wiggle it back off here. Okay. At this point, if you had an 05 to 07 5.9, you'd have a wastegate solenoid that needs to be unplugged, and that plug would be located just down deep in here, beside the engine block and the oil filter. This 03 doesn't have that, so we won't worry about it. All right, now we're going to take the last two nuts off the turbocharger and get the bad boy pulled out. So with all four nuts off now, the turbo is starting to slide down off the studs of the manifold. With the turbocharger out, it's a great time to inspect the exhaust manifold gaskets and upgrade to a BD pulse manifold. I recommend it because it's so easy at this time just to remove another 12 bolts and install it. It takes you about 20 minutes. And there, technically the BD manifold is installed, waiting the turbo to go in. The next step would be to swap over the oil feed fitting right here and install the new O-rings we'll have supplied in the kit. And once that's installed, we'll put the turbocharger on the truck. We'll be replacing this O-ring and this O-ring right here. Okay, with the new O-rings installed, we'll put a little bit of lube on there and thread them on in and tighten it up. Okay, once we feed it down under the manifold, we're going to line up these studs. We'll get these nuts started. The BD manifold supplies a couple of smaller nuts for the outside here. We'll reuse the factory ones in the rear. Okay, now that the nuts are in place and snugged up by hand, we're going to start tightening these nuts up. Now that the turbocharger is secured to the exhaust manifold, we're going to lift the truck back up, or if you're on the ground, just crawl underneath. We're going to hook up the oil drain and the exhaust system next. Now we have access to the oil drain tube. We'll install the supply gasket. Now that the oil drain is secured, we're going to put the exhaust casting back in with the new clamp provided and then reconnect the downpipe. Now that the casting's back in place, we've snugged up the clamp just by hand, just enough to move it still. We'll flip this next clamp on for the downpipe. And now we'll go underneath and release our ratchet strap so we can pull the downpipe and exhaust system forward to line up. We've got the downpipe lined up, clamp in place, now we'll snug that up. All right, now we'll finish tightening up the clamp right here at the casting to the turbocharger. Now we're just about wrapped up from the underneath or side view here. We're going to put the inner fender back in, and mount the wheel back on and torque the nuts up. All right, we're going to pre-oil the turbo with a little bit of engine oil, just right into the inlet fitting before we connect the feed line. So I just squirted some oil right down here into the oil inlet fitting. And now we can connect the feed line here. We're going to focus our attention on the intercooler boot and pipe here. We're going to just clean the boot with some brake clean and also the compressor outlet. Now we can install the boot. Again, like as if you had a 05 to 07 model year, there would be a solenoid in this location, and it would connect to a harness down by against the engine block right behind the oil filter. The 03 trucks don't have that, so we'll keep moving forward, and we'll install the intake air assembly and intake tube onto the charger. Now that the intake's in place, the last step would be to reconnect the negative battery terminals. Then we're going to fire up the truck, let it idle, check everywhere for leaks, make sure nothing's happening, and then we'll go for a road test and try out the new turbo. So now we're out on the road test just to verify the operation of the turbo, make sure everything's functioning as expected. We're trying to listen for boost leaks, look for excessive smoke. We're going to watch our gauges since we have some installed here, get an idea what kind of boost we're making. This truck with stock injectors and stock tune was making about 20 pounds of boost on the stock turbo. It's now seeing 27 since our wastegate is set up a little higher and the wheel can produce a little more. With increased fueling, we're seeing as high as 36 today. And it's coming on really nice. Yeah, once you complete the road test, you want to get back in the shop. Just double check for oil leaks. Look over the whole project, make sure you didn't miss anything. And that's pretty much the whole deal for installing a Screamer Turbo on a 5.9 Cummins. If you have any questions or need any help, just call our tech line, bddiesel.com.